G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's episode of Draw with JAZZA. I'm JAZZA and this is a video tutorial on the very basics of animating in Adobe Flash. Now what I've done with this tutorial is I've split it up into different key topics, so unless you're interested in going through the whole thing, make sure that if you're watching it in the YouTube Flash Play that you click on the annotation to skip to whatever is most relevant to what you're interested in looking at. Otherwise, we're just going to jump straight into it, and our first topic is setup. Okay, setup. So when I say setup, I mean establishing the basic parameters of the Flash project, of the animation project, so that it's ready for whatever you're doing it for. So it's going to be a total pain in the ass if when you set up the very first phase and you don't get the right aspect ratio or frame rate, and then the whole project is kind of pooped. So my general ones that I use, and it might be different for everyone depending on the project, I keep it to a 16:9 ratio, and you edit this in the properties settings without anything selected. I use 640x360 because that's a fairly decent size to embed into Flash websites like Newgrounds. It's 16:9 ratio, and I can also resize it in exporters later on for high definition. As for frame rate, I use 30 frames per second, which I believe is the standard for animation and film. But anywhere between 24 and 30 frames per second is what I would recommend when you set up the project. The timeline is the most robust part of the Flash animation experience, and it is something that you will very quickly and over time need to acquaint yourself with. So I'm going to just go through the features of the timeline here. So I've got my timeline, but I've also got this sample timeline here so that people downloading the PDF, which is in the description by the way, can have this as a reference. So over here we've got our layers. These are created by clicking on this button here, which is the new layer button. Layers, as in Photoshop, and it's a industry standard that the top layer appears above other layers. So if in this example the head is placed directly in front of the back hand or the front hand or the torso, the head is going to appear in front because it's the topmost layer. And if I want it to appear behind, I just click and drag the layer underneath where I want it to appear. So we also rename layers by double clicking, so that keeps organization simpler. Over here we have our layer, what would I call this? Layer viewing. Yeah, layer options. I'll do that. Layer options. I don't know the technical names for all this stuff. Just same. Anyways, so layer options. So we've got this first one here, which is this eye symbol, which is quite clearly visibility. So I can hide different layers by clicking that. Next we have the lock. So you can see here I've got the layer on which I have this image placed locked. So no matter what I do, I can't select it or alter it. But if I unlock it up here, then all of a sudden I can manipulate that. So I'll lock that again. And then finally we have the outline. So if I click here, this colored box, whatever color it is, when I click it, that object is outlined in that color and transparent elsewhere, aside from the edges. Down here we have our, play, ignore my slow writing, controls. So it's as simple as, moving forward and backwards through frames. I use keyboard shortcuts, which in particular is Enter. So you press the Enter key to play through the timeline. Or I use the, if you see the comma and full stop buttons, they're also the little arrows. They're moving forwards and backwards through frames. And I use them all the time. So it's very important to get used to keyboard shortcuts. You can see I've got keyboard shortcuts listed down here for other controls like testing and publishing. Over here we've got a loop tool, which is only available in CS5 or 5.5 and above. Here I've got onion skins. Now what this means is and we'll get into this when we go into frame by frame animation. What onion skins are, it enables you to see a specified amount of frames before or after the frame that you're currently on. In the same way that when animators, traditional animators who animate on paper, flip through paper to see frames before and after, similar effect to that. And there is also an outline tool and a edit multiple frames tool. Getting to the timeline itself, we have the frame numbers listed on top, which is pretty simple. You can see this is an excerpt from another animation I've done where there are thousands of frames, so they can get quite hefty. So this black symbol here is a new keyframe. Okay, so wherever you see that little black dot, it symbolizes where a keyframe position is placed. This blue line area is a tween. Oops. Okay, and this signifies the end of a keyframe area, this white box. Tweens have different colors. There are lots of other settings that you can see when you get into it, like masks and layer guides and all this stuff. But for now, for the sake of simplicity, that's all you need. And this is pretty straightforward too. You've got deleting layers and creating folders in which to group layers together. So that's the timeline, pretty well summarized there. Next, we're going to go into graphics. Now, graphics and movie clips are classed in a similar sort of thing, which is the symbol. So if I want to create a new symbol, I select this. This isn't a graphic yet. This is just a drawing I did with a brush tool and paint bucket. So if I select this raw drawing and press F8, which is the shortcut, you could also go, insert or create new symbol or whatever, but shortcuts. So I hit F8 with it selected, and I select graphic as the symbol type. Registration point doesn't necessarily matter until you're working on things like media, files, games, things like that, so you don't really need to worry about that. So the type is the graphic, and I'll name it Smiley Graphic. Enter. Now the first thing that does when I create a graphic symbol is if I open here my library, you'll see that the newest entry is this. So I can click and drag and place it on the timeline to my heart's content. I have it as an asset in my library that I can use as much as I want. So that's the first thing it does. I also can't erase it on the main timeline, things like that. It creates it as its own object. The other thing that is probably one of the coolest things about them is when you double click on it, you notice it becomes a raw drawing again, but what it's actually done is created an entirely new timeline. So I can return with that little back arrow, and we're back to where we were. But if I enter that by double clicking, it's like it's got its own folder now. It's like it's got its own timeline zone thing. Okay, so if I wanted to animate within this graphic, it's all good. I can completely do that, and that's animated. But the other thing to remember is if I go back to this main timeline and I want that animation, so if I animate this moving, I'll hit F6 for a duplicate keyframe and move him across, then back, and we have this really quick jittery loop like that. If I go back to the main timeline and pause the frame on a test by hitting Control Enter, I'm testing it, nothing plays. Okay, so it's not looping or anything. So to actually loop that, I'd need the frame space on the main timeline, which would be, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that, to show that loop. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. But with that slight difficulty aside, graphics are some of the most useful things that I use consistently. I often convert the body parts of a tweened character, like arms, torso, head, blah, 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 into graphics. I animate all my talking in a graphic symbol. So I create a head graphic, and then all my animation for the mouth, for the eyes, and facial movement is within the graphics, because then when I go back to the main timeline and that head is animated, I can move it, tween it, move it up and down, all that stuff without actually changing or affecting the animation that I've done. So it plays within an open timeline. It's great for tweening groups and reference while animating, like I just mentioned. It needs frame space to play, so if you want it to loop and play the internal animation of a graphic, you need the appropriate number of frames on the main timeline to show such. But the other thing is it cannot include effects or have endless loops or like filters and stuff. So moving on from graphics, we have movie clips. So movie clips are very similar. If I want to create this raw vector drawing into a movie clip, same process. I hit F8 as a shortcut. I select down here and I select movie clip and name this Smiley MC for movie clip and go OK. So same thing. It goes into the library. So we've got a Smiley graphic and Smiley MC. You see the little thumbnails are different. So graphics have that little blocks thumbnail and movie clips have that cog. Now, in most obvious cases for game design, movie clips are the most useful for several reasons. They have functionality with code. They have the ability to loop endlessly without the needed frame space. So if I do exactly what I did with the graphic, go inside this symbol. So by double clicking, I enter it. It gets its own timeline. I hit F6, move it across and back, and we see I've got my little jittery repeated animation there. If I go back to the main timeline and test this, but I've got a pause frame up here, so it pauses when it tests when I press Control Enter, you'll see that even though it's not moving frames on the main timeline, it's paused on the frame in which this movie clip is playing, it's still playing the internal animation. So that's very useful for a lot of things, games in particular, but in this example you can see that the main timeline isn't moving at all, the movie clip continues to be animated. So that is something to keep in mind because it's a very useful tool. There are lots of other things that movie clips do that graphics can't, but also vice versa. So it plays loops when only viewing a SWF, tested or publishes, so as I just demonstrated. It's great for adding effects and loops within loops, loopception if you will. An example of this is if I go to the properties panel with my movie clip selected, you can see this filters area. I can select this little page here and I can add a new filter. So something like a drop shadow, a blur, bevel, gradients, color adjustments. These can be only done on movie clips and buttons, not on graphics. So I'll add a blur and I'll make it a really wide blur. And then when I test that, you can see that it's got that sort of motion blur effect. And I can go back in here and remove that. So that's an example as to the effects and filters that I can add to movie clips that I cannot add to graphics. The other thing, like I mentioned, is that this whole loops within loops thing, this is much more difficult to pull off in graphics, but I can have lots of different movie clips with lots of different numbers of frames and animations and put them within one movie clip and they all play consistently at their own, animated pace, even though there's only one frame space. Now, this is getting a bit more tricky, but this is much more for things like, action scenes, games is one of those big ones, special effects, things like fireballs and all this stuff. I always use movie clips for that sort of thing. It can loop on a single frame endlessly, but it cannot be viewed in motion on the main timeline. So as I demonstrated with the graphic, if I expand the timeline of the graphic and play, it shows the animation, but with a movie clip, it does not show. So that's one of the difficult things to deal with movie clips, is because you might animate a special effect like an explosion in a movie clip and add filters like glows and blurs and all this stuff, but you can't actually view it in the FLA file, in the Flash file, until you render it, until you test or export it by Control Enter or Shift F12. So that's something to keep in mind. You have to really kind of have a good sense of the motion and animation and timing within the file, within the animation itself, to get a good grasp as to how things are going to play out. Next we have Keyframe Animation. So the reason I went through graphics and movie clips before going through Keyframe Animation is mainly because I wanted to demonstrate these within movie clips so that I didn't have to create too many new frames. I can just have one frame for each of those. So for Keyframe Animation, I will demonstrate with a ball. So I'm going to create a ball. That's a terrible ball. Maybe I should use like a proper tool here. Okay. So I'm going to mess with this a bit. The properties, I'll make it thicker. I'll convert this to a movie clip. I'll call this ball. Enter. So now I'll go inside this to edit it. So modify, where are we? Convert lines to fills. These are just little tricks that don't have much to do with animation. I'm just trying to get this picture done. Okay. And what are basketballs like? I don't know how to draw basketballs, so this is my lame attempt at a basketball. Okay. So this is my lame attempt at a basketball. Okay. So if I go back to the main timeline, you can see that this is its own object. I can move it around. If I want to keyframe animate this, so using new keyframes without tweening, what I'll do is I'll draw a line for what I'll use as the ground area. I'll select both of these and press F8 to convert them to a new symbol, and I'll call it FBF underscore bounce. Now FBF is a kind of shortened way of saying frame by frame. So keyframe animation is also referred to as frame by frame animation. I want to divide these so that they're on separate layers, so I can select both of them and right click and go distribute to layers. And you can see that over here on the timeline, it's created two layers. It's named one of them ball because the symbol is named ball, and the other is just a drawing. So I'll name that layer ground. So with this ball selected, in keyframe animation, if I want to start it up here, bounce it along like this, all I have to do is select the frame it's on, press F6 to create the next keyframe and move it across. Now, I don't have a reference to where the ball was, so to create that reference, I'm going to click here and create an onion skin and make sure it only has the previous frame selected. Now, with that ball selected, I'm going to hit F6 again. I can widen my onion skin to show even more frames. F6 again. Get it to speed up a bit. F6 again. Move it down. And as it hits F6, I'm going to squash the ball like this. F6 again, I'm going to expand it back out and pull it over here. Maybe rotate it a little bit. I'll turn off the magnet. F6 again, I'm going to have it speed up. F6, rotate, move. F6, rotate, move. And it's going to be slowing down now. F6, F6, rotate, F6, and it's going to speed up. F6. Okay. So if I play that, you can see that pretty quickly we've made a fluid looking bouncing ball. And this is, as you can see up here, all with a new keyframe each. Okay, now F6 is the shortcut, as I explained, to duplicating a keyframe. F5 is the shortcut for adding keyframes, so adding length or adding frames to that keyframe. So if I wanted to have the ball pause up here in midair, I can select that, go F5, and it lengthens that by 1 without adding a new keyframe. Okay. And then the other shortcut that is commonly used is F7, which creates a completely new keyframe, deleting the one previous to it. This is most useful in frame-by-frame animation where you're drawing each new frame. So that is an example as to keyframe animation. Now, when I go back to my main timeline and I test by hitting Control and Enter with my action script pausing it on this frame, because it's a movie clip, it will consistently loop through this. Okay, so remember those shortcuts: add frame, duplicate, and new frame. I have this wrong here. I wrote G7, but it's actually F7, so forgive that. Okay, so that's keyframe animation. Now next is tweens. Now, as an example to this, I'm going to do the same thing that I did for my keyframe animation. So to copy this frame exactly as it is, I'm going to hit Control-Alt-C, go across to my tweens layer and hit Control-Alt-V to paste. I'll move it down. Control-Alt-C and Control-Alt-V are shortcuts to copying and pasting whatever frames you have selected. So you can select a bulk of frames, copy them all exactly as they are, and paste them elsewhere. Okay. Now with tween animation, if I go into this previous animation that I did that was frame by frame and totally remove all of this and make it all empty except for this one ball, how I would animate this with tweens, doing the exact same motion, was I would find where the ball fell around here, it hit the ground, create a duplicate keyframe with F6, it came down here, then the next area it ends up on at the end is, let's say, over here, turned a bit, like that. So between those two, I'm going to add another frame up here. So the ball's going to bounce, hit down there, bounce up, and then go over there. Now the difference between keyframes and tweens are pretty simple. Keyframes are either replicating or making completely new images based on those frames. Tweens are taking an object and moving it from one place to another. Now there are two types of tweens. There are motion tweens and shape tweens. Motion tweens are the most used, that I use the most at least. So this scenario calls for a motion tween. So I'll select all the frames between which the motion tween will happen. I right click and hit create classic tween or create motion tween. And now when I play, you'll notice that we've got that bounce happening. It's pretty simple, okay? A shape tween, which I'll just demonstrate really quickly because, you know, they're a bit trickier to work with and they take more time and practice than I have to demonstrate. But if I create this ball here and then at the end frame hit F6, I'm just going to hide that, and pull some of these points like this. So we've got two frames, and between those I create a shape tween. You'll notice that it pulls the shape like that. Now, the more complicated the shape, the more difficulty it's going to have. So I'm not going to get into detail there because that's something that can take a lot of time. What I do want to show is something that people don't use very often when they're new to Flash in motion tweens and shape tweens, which is the easing tool. Now, this is very, very important because when a ball bounces and it goes down, hits the ground, bounces up and across, it doesn't travel at the same rate the whole time. It slows up, it speeds up, slows down consistently. Okay, I'm going to add another frame at the end here of the ball rolling to a stop and create the classic tween. So it bounces like this. Okay? Now, with easing, what I do is I select the tween, the single tween area. So this selection between this frame and this frame, I'm only selecting this arrow area. I go to my properties and you can see tween ease at 0. Okay, I'm going to drag this into -100. So it's going to, at its full capacity, ease in. What that means is it starts off slower and the motion builds up speed. Okay, so rather than just traveling consistently, and you can see just by watching that, it instantly adds weight to the movement. Okay, now same with the bounce. As soon as it hits the ground and bounces up, you'll notice that with the frame by frame one, it slowed down in the air, then sped up as it bounced again. So on the travel up, we're going to have this ease out, which means that when it eases out, it travels quickly at first and then slows down. And then on the second half, we're going to ease in. So it travels slower, then goes in fast. Okay, so you'll notice the first selection is when the ball gains speed and pulls down, so it eases in. Then when it bounces and hits instantly up, it eases out because it's fast, then it's slow. Then for the second half of that bounce, it's slow, then it's fast, so it eases back in. And then for the very final bit, which is the roll, we want this to ease out because it's going to get slower and slower and slower. So it goes faster and then it slows into its stop. So watching this, you'll notice that it's got a lot more weight to it. This ball looks much more solid as an object. Now, this is a principle that I will go into in more detail in future animation tutorials, things like squash and stretch and anticipation and, much more motion-based frame-by-frame tutorials. But this is an example which can show quite clearly that slowing down and speeding up is a very important part of both tween animation and frame-by-frame animation. Next, we're going into masks. So here's my Phantom of the Opera character. I just drew him for fun. I'm going to drag him over here. Masks are exactly what the name implies. A mask hides or shows something in particular. So an example as to how I will use a mask is I'm going to open my library and I've pre-prepared this graphic. And I'm going to make this character vomit violently on the ground. Okay? So if I double click on him to select him, and he's got his own animation space now, which is empty save for that single frame. I want to animate him vomiting, but I don't want to spend too long creating, frame by frame animations. Now, if I had the time, I would, but for this demonstration, I want to show you how a mask can really speed up that process. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my puke stream. So I'll hide him for now. I'll select a nice gross puke color. And I'm going to make it nice and wavy. Okay, so this is going to be a constant stream of puke. And I'm just going to add a bunch of random detail. Just lines, bits of corn, a bit more green. Maybe some really light white thin lines to show that it's liquid. Okay. Now I'm going to select this, create a movie clip. So selecting that, hit F8, create a movie clip. Now it doesn't need to be a movie clip in specific. It can be a graphic. It doesn't matter. I just need it to be an animatable symbol. So I'll call it puke loop. Or I'll just call it puke. Okay. Okay, so this is my puke symbol. Okay, now I'll bring my boy back. Now what I want to do is I want to have this puke looping in a constant stream out of his mouth. But as you can see, if I put it on top of his head there, it appears in front of his face. I want it to kind of come out of his mouth. So what I'm going to do is I'll put the puke aside for now. I'm going to create a layer on top of the puke. I love saying puke. Okay, now I'm just going to, in a nice rich red, specify where I want this puke to show. Okay, so I want it to appear in this area, like that. And it can show anywhere else up until here when it hits the floor. So if I color that in, now it doesn't matter how neat this is because they're not going to see this shape in particular, okay? This is going to act as the mask area. So this red area that I've just drawn, if I bring the puke over here like this, behind it, and then create a mask on this red layer, so hit mask, as you can see that the puke only shows in the area that I've specified. So you can think of many ways in which this would be extremely useful, and I'll show you a demonstration as to how I could animate this. Now I'm just going to lock my puke layer and onion skin it, or not onion skin it, just make it transparent so I can see the outline of the area that I work in. I'm going to make my puke a bit smaller. I'm going to add another layer within this mask so you can see that the actual masked layers are connected underneath the main mask area. So everything within that main mask area will show within it. Okay, so I've got 2 puke layers and I'm going to add a third. Okay, so I've got 3 puke streams going on here. Okay, so if I start up here, what I want to do is create a tween for each of these 3 clips, these 3 puke objects, and I want to have this line here meet up, so you'll notice there's a divide there, meet up with this divide here. Okay, so to make more sense of it, I'll show you what I mean. So this is where it starts. I'm going to create a duplicate keyframe of these 3 back here, so F6, so you can see that these 3 have that keyframe. I'm going to drag this line roughly to a microcosm before the other one begins. Okay. Now, if I create a tween between these three, so create classic tween, you'll notice that when it loops and the frames are locked, it constantly makes this endless stream of puke. So I can go back to my main timeline, hit Control Enter, and you can see this guy is having a pretty rough time with his sickness. But that demonstrates how I could use a mask. The endless loop thing is, optional or whatever. It's all dependent on the situation. I could use masks for lots of different things. If I want to have an explosion but have it shown behind the barrel but haven't drawn the layers, I can just make a mask area excluding the barrel, and then the explosion will show behind the barrel. So there are lots of uses for masks, and this is just a simple demonstration of that. Finally, we have our publishing. Now, there are lots of publish settings to keep in mind, but the main ones are the most important ones. So you can find our publish settings when we go File, Publish Settings. Now, there are lots of different settings that we can publish to. There are image formats, and there's the Flash format. Okay, so in the Flash format, we want to make sure that we have the right Flash player selected. We want to, if we have images or JPEGs or whatever in the Flash, we can select the quality it exports to here. Make sure that audio is changed to a better setting, because the default audio setting in Flash is awful. So we do that by clicking here, and we can change this bitrate to around 80 or 112. And we just do that for both audio stream and audio event. Go OK. Now this will change the file size. It will make it a larger file size if you have lots of audio, but in this day and age that doesn't really matter very much. Okay, so that's in particular for Swift Publishing. Okay, Swift Publishing is good for Flash websites like I shouldn't have written YouTube, I meant Newgrounds. Other websites that take Flash animations are like Flash portals like Google Flash Portal, but Newgrounds is the most common one. Now, in terms of publishing a video, now this is a question I get quite a lot. Flash doesn't have very good video publishing settings. In fact, I've never had a successful video published within Flash that I can think of. It's just awful. The movie clips don't often turn out. The best thing to do is to get an external program. So whether you're using a screen capture, which I wouldn't recommend because it drops frames unless you have an extremely powerful computer. The best thing to do is to Google something like Swift to Video. SWF is the file which Flash commonly exports to, and if you want to convert it to video, you're going to look for a Swift to Video converter. Newgrounds is working on one at the moment called Swivel, but that's still in progress, and I will inform you all when that's out because that'll be fantastic. But for now, I use one called Moya. It has a weird name, but I'm going to open it here and show you what this looks like. Oops. Oh. So this is my Swift to Video, Moya Swift to Video Pro Converter. So you just bring the Flash file in here, and you can change your export settings and convert it. And it's particularly good because you can change the speed at which it converts. You can play a game and it can convert that process, but playing it slower, so there's no frame drop, things like that. So I hope this video has been informative for you. If you enjoy the tutorials that I create, make sure that you subscribe, rate and comment and all that stuff. Make sure to let me know if you have any suggestions, because this video in itself was created on request for a user. So again, thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed, and have a good day. I hope you enjoyed this video. Links are below to download the original files for reference. Remember, if you animate or draw something cool, be sure to share it on Newgrounds.com, the internet's best source for animations, games, art and music. Until next time, see you later.